Hi, everyone. I'm Andrea Sato. I work on adult programs here at the library, and we're glad you made it this morning. We're pleased once again to partner with SPED NET, Wilton Public Schools, and Newtown SPED PTA for an important talk on transitioning to college with our speaker, Robert Tudisco. So with that, I will turn it over to Eve Kessler of SPED NET to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thanks for coming, everybody. For those of you new to SPEDNet, we are spednet.org. All of the presentations that we have are videotaped and posted on our website as well as our YouTube channel. It's fabulous to be able to share them with spouses, with your special ed team, or whatever. We have a fabulous website with hundreds of articles and information, as well as the video library. We also will send out everybody a copy of the video and the PDF, which will also be up on the website in the next couple of days. Robert Tudisco is one of our favorite speakers. He is just amazing. He is a nationally recognized author, motivational speaker, and nonprofit management consultant, and is also an adult diagnosed with ADHD. He graduated from Fordham University Law School and subsequently served 4 years as an assistant district attorney in Bronx County. He is senior counsel to Barger and Gaines and has over 25 years of legal experience specializing in criminal law, disability advocacy, education law, and public policy. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I don't know if any of you have seen me speak before, but there will be a constant theme of things. I think that before we get anywhere in terms of the legal issues and social issues that we're going to talk about today in terms of transitions, that it's really important to understand the nature of ADHD, how it impacts students, as well as learning disabilities. And, keeping that in mind in terms of understanding the student and helping to design an effective program or accommodations as they transition into post-secondary. I apologize for the typeset. I did not do this on an IBM typewriter. It kind of came out that way in the formatting process when I saved it to a thumb drive, but we're going to move forward in any case. Right, we're going to talk about transitions today for students, post-secondary transitions for students with ADHD and LD, all right? Now, students with ADHD and LD are extremely bright students, and a common theme that you're going to hear today is going to be that ADHD and learning disabilities and other disabilities are not intelligence deficits. They are performance deficits. It's really important to keep that in mind, okay? Every client that I represent in getting services at school, these are extremely bright kids, okay? Sometimes they are too bright and they wind up getting into trouble. But the bottom line is you have to keep that mindset moving forward. They have talents and they have a lot of potential, but there's a lot of pitfalls. Students with LD and ADHD are high risk going into post-secondary. They're 3 times more likely to be held back compared to those without. They are twice as likely to drop out of high school compared to those without ADHD, 7 times less likely to graduate college in 4 years, which is something that your pocketbooks, would resonate with. A lot of times that they are kind of floating about in post-secondary without any real direction as to where to go. We all think it's a great idea, just send them to college, they'll get an education. Okay, even if they don't do anything with it, they'll be an educated unemployed person. But there are things that we'll talk about in terms of proactive strategies that may be able to minimize that In terms of some kids, it may be beneficial for them to take a gap year, to start out in a community college for a couple of years and then matriculate into a full 4-year college. So there are a number of things that you can do proactively, and we'll go into that today. All right, and they're 3 times more likely to get suspended or expelled, which becomes an issue in college. You don't have the same rights that you do when they are a high school student under IDEA. Okay, so that's kind of like setting the stage for what we're going to talk about and how difficult this transition is and how it is made more difficult. First of all, it's difficult for any student to transition to post-secondary. It's a whole nother world that they're going into. But for kids with executive functioning impairment, ADHD, learning disabilities, it is really a recipe for disaster. And what makes it worse, we're going to go through also the changes in the law from when they graduate from 12th grade and go on to post-secondary that really make things a lot worse if you are not vigilant and you are not addressing these things proactively. All right? So let's talk about an overview of what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover an understanding of ADHD, the impact of ADHD and LD on transition to post-secondary, the social impact of ADHD on the transition to college, the legal implications as they graduate from high school and no longer have the protections of IDEA. So their IEPs kind of vaporize upon graduating from high school. And that makes for a much more difficult climate for you as parents and for them as students, in addition to a lot of the challenges that are imposed by the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, otherwise known as FERPA. There are significant changes as to how that is enforced as they make the transition. It's okay. Sorry about that. So, and we're also going to talk about a number of practical strategies that you can undertake proactively to address these issues. And I guess it is, if you know what's coming, all right? I went to law school. I got a diploma. I didn't get a magic wand. Nothing I say here today is going to be a magic bullet that's going to make all of your anxiety or concerns go away. The analogy I like to use is it can be the difference between navigating a minefield with a map in your hand versus being chased through one blindfolded, okay? They're both very dangerous. They're filled with pitfalls, but if you know what's coming, you may be able to navigate it a little bit, even as difficult as it may be, okay? So now, let's talk about ADHD first, and then I'll go into some examples of different learning disabilities. So ADHD, what is it? ADHD is a neurobiological condition. Before I go into this any further, I'm going to say I'm not a doctor. This is my understanding of it, living with ADHD for 60 years. And I like to say that I don't suffer from ADHD. I have ADHD. My wife suffers from ADHD because she married me, and she's along for the ride, unfortunately. And I assume that a lot of you are here because you are someone who's impacted by ADHD based upon a family member, a child, or so on. So my understanding, and this is a gross oversimplification, is that ADHD is a neurobiological condition that affects the prefrontal cortex of the brain. That's the portion of the brain that regulates executive functioning, okay? And it's a lot more complicated than that, but if you boil it down, that's probably the basis of it. And also, that portion of the brain communicates with the rest of you by the flow of and the receipt of neurotransmitters, okay? And it is essentially a neurological dysfunction of these three: dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. And just so you kind of understand, norepinephrine is essentially adrenaline, okay? And dopamine is really the the chemical that really helps you appreciate pleasure. Okay. And a lot of these kids are always looking for excitement, looking for danger, high risk, high stim activity. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides to illustrate why that is. And for the purposes, I do a lot of presentations about school discipline and behavior. And usually I talk about that because the flooding of adrenaline, a lot of these kids will gravitate towards crisis, or they will even create their own chaos and crisis because it's a means of coping with this neurological problem. For today's purposes, there's another issue that arises with respect to students transitioning to post-secondary, and that is if the problems with the neurological process that goes along and the neurotransmitters, if that is not addressed or they're not coping with it in some negative way, they kind of have a tendency to just kind of float aimlessly. And there is an awful lot of cognitive hyperactivity that keeps them from moving forward. And what you will find, as we'll talk about a little bit later, is the way college is set up. It's set up as a recipe for disaster because of the lack of inherent structure that these kids have. Okay, they hate living with their parents as adolescents because of the structure that you provide. They hate high school because high school, outside of law enforcement, high school is probably, middle school, high school is probably the closest thing you'll ever come to a prison in real life. Okay, their days are highly structured. The bell rings. They're constantly head counting. They get their time in the yard every day. But when they go to college, it's a very different world, and then typically not at home with their parents if they go away to school. And that lack of structure is a disaster, okay? But we're going to get into that a little bit later. So to really talk about executive functioning, and again, I apologize for that'll be fixed, by the way, when you get your PDF. Executive functions are organization, prioritization, time perception, impulse control, self-regulation, attention regulation. Okay, these are all problems that neurologically people with ADHD are challenged with on a daily basis. Time is, well, first of all, organization, starting there. Executive functioning impairment really, because of that portion of your brain that organizes everything, if it's a defective prefrontal cortex, you're going to have problems organizing anything. When people say someone with ADHD doesn't manage their time well, that's really a gross understatement. Someone with ADHD can't manage anything well. Time is a particular problem because it is about time perception, okay? If thoughts and impulses are whizzing around the Grand Canyon of your head constantly, there's a huge disconnection between the physical reality of life. And so that disconnection is amplified for them, okay? It's about an inability to accurately estimate how long a task is going to take to do. Always thinking you have more time to do something than you actually do. And that disconnection, coupled with the inability to organize anything, presents a particular problem with students with executive functioning impairment as they go off to college and they're really expected to do things on their own without any structure. And it is a particular problem for them. Okay. And their short-term memory is another issue that has to do more with studying and actually understanding what's going on at any given moment. If you think of your brain as a computer, for instance, there's two types of memory in your computer. There is long-term memory, which is essentially the storage in the computer, how many terabytes or whatever the computer can store. That's basically a huge file cabinet of information. The other type of memory in a computer that's crucial to functioning properly is the RAM, the random access memory, which is more important. That's essentially how many programs can be open at one time, how many different things your computer can do instantly. That's where people with ADHD have a huge problem, okay? Which leads to forgetting where you left your keys, or, in college, I was not diagnosed. I didn't get diagnosed till I was 34. But I actually had a girlfriend in college when I would go to her apartment for a date, and I would knock on her apartment door. She would block the entrance with a basket, and she would say, "Keys, wallet, and glasses. Give them to me now, otherwise you can't come in. Because I'm not spending an hour looking for them with you. We're going to miss the movie or whatever." So it really is a short-term memory issue, okay? Now, when we were all in middle school, okay, when I was young, they used to call it junior high. Now they call it middle school. But we all learned that if you put your hand on a hot stove or you touch a hot fireplace or something like that, a signal goes up your arm to your brain that says it's hot, move your hand. And so we just assume that it's like an electric light bulb. You plug it into the wall and the light goes on. The electricity goes along the wire and it goes on. But your body, your central nervous system is not like that, okay? Your body is not made up of one long continuous wire. Your body is made up of, I dare say, millions of disconnected wires, okay? And the wires are connected, those gaps are connected by those neurotransmitters that flow back and forth. And on the edges of those gaps, there are also specific receptors for those brain chemicals. And if there are not enough receptors or not enough chemicals flowing back and forth, you're going to have an interruption or a shortage or a blockage in the flow, okay? And that's important to understand what's going on here. That's why a lot of kids with ADHD are typically the thrill seekers, okay? They are constantly trying to flood themselves with adrenaline or dopamine to compensate for that issue. And if they're not, you have a college-bound kid who has some kind of a blockage here and typically will move about without any clear direction as to what they're supposed to do. And that's really, it's helpful to understand that, so that you know what they're experiencing. And as frustrated as you may get, if you're an educator with your students or as a parent with your children, they are just as frustrated with themselves, and they are also frustrated that they're not being understood. That's really important for you to kind of wrap your head around if you can. All right. Now, there's a lot of people talk about executive functioning impairment versus ADHD. What's the difference, okay? Executive functions are all of those functions. Before I showed a picture of the conductor of the symphony, and that's essentially what your prefrontal cortex does. And all of those functions, organization, prioritization, all of that stuff is what's done there, okay? You can have an executive functioning impairment if you think about it as concentric circles, okay? On the outer edge, you could have mild executive functioning impairment. You could have more profound executive functioning impairment in the second layer. And in the center, executive functioning impairment that is so profound that it's clinically diagnosable as ADHD. Okay? So to flip it around, someone with an executive functioning impairment may need some support, but they don't necessarily have ADHD. Someone with ADHD definitely has an executive functioning impairment. Okay? So if you think about it that way, as like a spectrum in a way. All right, terminology. What's the difference between ADD and ADHD? There really is none. There have been a lot of different permutations. When I was diagnosed, there was ADHD. there was ADD and AD/HD, and then it became whoever they are decided to get rid of the slash, and it became ADHD. There are typically three types: hyperactive ADHD, hyperactive, inattentive, and a combined type. In my opinion, and this is not a clinical opinion, this is just my personal opinion, I believe that there's really no such thing as inattentive ADHD. Yes, there are students who are not exhibiting outward hyperactivity, and even the young, usually, not always, young boys that you would see as the typical traditional ADHD type. Many times that hyperactivity, the outward hyperactivity, decreases after puberty, okay? And so a lot of people used to say they grow out of it, which is not the case, because all of the other issues and symptoms kind of go along with it. But even the kid who is sitting at the back of the classroom staring out the window, who is kind of referred to as the inattentive type, I still believe there is hyperactivity. I believe that it is a cognitive hyperactivity, okay? If you think of a picture, if you're watching like a National Geographic special or something, and there's a diver and he's videoing a swarm of thousands and thousands of, like a school of fish, okay? It's like one big swarming movement of separate entities. That is what we see every single day in our heads. And each one of those fish is an idea. And a lot of times what will happen, and I've been told this by others, when I say something that is completely random, it's because that none of those swirling thoughts are filed anywhere appropriately. They're always there churning around. And kind of like a word association test, if we say something, the first word that comes to your mind, what is it? Constantly, any stimulus will knock one of those fish out of the swarm, and you got to deal with it. And that's why things come up at random. And it really is very difficult for someone who doesn't have ADHD, a neurotypical person, if there is such a thing, to really understand how that works. The first time I told my wife, she was horrified by it, okay? There's another model that I use, and that is, if you picture a place like New York City, which is the center of commerce and culture, music, fashion, whatever, in the world. But instead of several international airports, there's one poorly designed landing strip, okay? So the swarm, these planes are coming in from all over the world. But instead of a bunch of well-run airports, there's one landing strip that is poorly run. So there's no place for them to land. So what do they do in an airport situation? They just circle them over the airport in holding patterns. But if one of those airplanes had an emergency on it, a mechanical problem, God forbid, a bomb, a terrorist threat, something, medical emergency, it would get instant clearance to land because it's an emergency. And a lot of people with ADHD often gravitate towards crisis, and a lot of students even create their own crisis and chaos because it is a twisted coping mechanism, okay? It's a means of forced prioritization. It's a way to move forward when there's no structure around them. And a lot of times, kids in college that are not structured the way that you would structure their environment as a parent or in high school, for instance, they'll just kind of flounder around. And, you know, and another issue is they also don't get a lot of feedback like they did in high school. There isn't a quiz every week. Maybe there's a midterm and a final. And they don't realize one of the things about people with ADHD is that we're not very good self-observers. So I never realized what a terrible driver I was until I got married, and my wife told me. You know, it's just you don't realize how all over the place you are. And when you're out there without a parent, without a teacher, without a guidance counselor, it's very difficult to know how badly things are going until you get the letter that says you're going to be put on academic probation. You are in danger of losing your scholarship. You may be asked to leave the school. And those letters typically come in very late in the game. Okay? Okay. Learning disabilities. Essentially, neurologically based processing problems that interfere with basic learning skills. And this can come up in many different ways. People often think of learning disabilities and the word dyslexia comes to mind because that's probably one of the more common ones. But there are others. Dyscalculia, in terms of kids having difficulty with numbers and the relationship from number to number, or dysgraphia, kids having difficulty writing. Another one that's interesting is there's a learning disability called phonemic awareness. And that is the inability of a child to connect the phonetic sound with the printed word. And there's typically a disconnect. And what's interesting about that particular learning disability is a lot of these kids during reading will actually shut down because they're just not getting it. And it is often misdiagnosed as ADHD when it is not. It's a specific learning disability that needs to be addressed, which raises another issue that you should be very cautious and careful about the evaluations that you get to make sure it is someone that is going to look at everything that is going on. Okay, there is an old saying, and it's going to come up later in some of the slides, that there's an old saying that ADHD rarely walks alone. In 70% of cases, there is a co-occurring disability. And if there is a learning disability that's misdiagnosing ADHD or another co-occurring condition like bipolar disorder, that could impact medication decisions. And so you really need to look at everything that's going on. And it can also dictate the services that you need to ask for, or more aptly for this presentation, the accommodations that you're going to need to ask for when your child goes to college, right? Or into the working world. They can interfere with specific processes. And when it comes to dyslexia and the inability to read, not only can it impair common life functions, ordering at a restaurant, for instance, or taking an exam, but it's not just reading. It bleeds into other subjects. If a student can't read effectively, they're not going to be able to tackle word problems in math, even if they're good with numbers. Okay? They're not going to be able to read the science chapter and answer the questions at the end of the chapter. So there are a number of issues where a specific learning disability can bleed off into other academic areas, okay? All right. Like I said, ADHD rarely walks alone. And again, I will say this a lot. If you're going to take something away from this presentation, really you have to think of it. And it's important to instill this in your kids too, because a lot of times when they go off to college, they are reluctant to identify as a student with a disability and request accommodations. And they feel, many of them, and I've spoken to many of them over the years, they feel like ADHD or a learning disability that they had was something that their parents told them that they had and made them feel stupid or not as smart as the other kids or broken in some way. And when they go off to college, they just feel like, I'm going to leave that classification at home, okay? I just want to fit in with everybody else. The last thing I want to do is go to the disability office and ask for, printed notes or extended time or anything like that. I don't want to identify as a disabled student. And that is really tragic because of the way the law is set up when they get there. And so it's really important to instill upon them that it's not about how intelligent they are. It is about how they perform with traditional learning, okay? And that's just, if you take away anything from today, that's a really important thing that you should kind of keep in mind always. All right, transitions are always difficult for people with ADHD or learning disabilities, because shifting gears in some exciting way can be easy to do because of adrenaline, but if it's not an exciting thing to do, it can be a nightmare. Okay, there are a number of transitions that are particularly difficult. The 3rd to 4th grade transition is usually a nightmare for kids. Before 3rd to 4th grade, they're typically evaluated based upon how generally intelligent they are and how they get along with the other kids. And unless they're cracking somebody in the head with a textbook, things seem to be okay. 3rd to 4th grade, there is a lot more that's asked of them administratively. Homework enters their lives. Okay, and that becomes an impossibility for many of these kids. I could tell you right now, growing up as an undiagnosed student with ADHD and going through Catholic school, it was a nightmare. I never, ever, ever did homework. It amazes me that many of my clients with ADHD do the assignments and just never turn them in. They're in the bottom of a locker or a school bag or something, because I could just never do it. Okay, so that transition, and I'll show you a graphic later on where it's the administrative stuff that gets in the way of how intelligent they really are. They kind of trip over themselves. Okay, the next one is elementary school to middle school, and in each one of these transitions, the problem is that the school will tell them, and you maybe as parents may even tell them, you're expected to be doing more now that you're in middle school, now that you're in high school. And so there is a lot of assumptions that are made for kids that have significant executive functioning impairment. Okay, middle school to high school, it gets worse. And personally, I think the worst out of all of them is high school to college. The law changes. Most of these kids leave home. They don't have you there providing support or advocating for them. And it's almost like we kind of cut them loose in space. And it really is a recipe for disaster for them unless you take some proactive measures. Okay, and college to the workforce is also very difficult. All right, my experience has been that these kids are all very intelligent students. And they will say things to me when I ask them, what do you not like about school? What makes you angry about school? And they will often say, it's not that the work's that much harder, it's there's more things I have to remember to do this year, okay? And that includes, once they get to that 3rd to 4th grade level, middle school going into high school, they have to keep their paperwork organized. They have different classes. Sometimes they will forget to bring their lunch, which may not seem like a big deal, but a component to a lot of these disabilities is an extreme amount of anxiety that they experience and frustration. And something small like that can really get blown out of proportion and knock them off their day, okay? They have to maybe bring their lunch money or some administrative thing for school. They have to remember this isn't as applicable, it shows my age, to bring the right book home. Now there are very few books. But I remember asking for accommodations for kids with ADHD or some learning disabilities where we would ask for a second set of books at home to eliminate that issue. They have to have a different binder or notebook for each class, which can get confusing. I was the obnoxious kid who never had a pen for class, constantly, desperately begging to borrow a pen because I wasn't prepared. I now go nowhere without 3 pens in my pocket because of that, okay? But it is something small that can really hold them back. Another issue, and this gets back to time, and that is that now their assignments are timed. It's not just like read this paragraph and answer 2 questions and we're going to discuss it in 15 minutes. You have 4 weeks to do a book report. And no matter how much time they get, because of the planes whizzing around, they're not going to do it until it's an emergency, until very late the Sunday night before the Monday that it's due, no matter how much time they've had for that project. And it can be frustrating for you, But if you stop for a second to think about the 4 weeks of anxiety that they've gone through knowing this, I'll tell you right off the bat, I never did homework as a kid, ever did homework. And I wasn't allowed to watch TV unless my homework was done. And I have these vivid memories of going upstairs to my bedroom after dinner and not being able to turn on the TV. And I knew that I hadn't done my homework. And if I go to school tomorrow without my homework, I'm going to get in trouble. And at the end of the marking period, I'm going to get in trouble because my grades are going to reflect that. And I remember sitting on the floor of my bedroom with a knot in my stomach, unable to move forward, okay? Unable to do anything except just kind of ruminate about what was going on. It was almost like my ADHD was like a wet blanket that was a paralysis, okay? And a lot of these kids will experience this, and many of them will cope by waiting till it's an emergency. You know, there's no more tomorrow. I have to do it tonight. Okay, and we're going to see when they go to post-secondary how that model actually gets even worse. All right, the transition from high school to college is difficult for any student. It's another world completely, right? There's a complete lack of structure, support, and accountability. The three things that people with ADHD and many with learning disabilities can't develop on their own without external support, okay? And when it's not there, it becomes a nightmare for them. They're away from home and the structure that they rebel against, but that you provide, that they need. There's a lack of feedback, and there are a number of medication issues. These kids that go away to college either don't want to take their medication, or they don't think that they need to take their medication as often as perhaps they were getting it before they went away to college. And I have to say something. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. If a student tells you, I don't think I need to take this every day, or I don't think I need to take this as often, it's their bodies. They understand how the medication impacts them. I've been taking medication for many years now, since I was diagnosed, in easily 25 years, okay? And it's made a huge difference in my life. But some people complain about different side effects or whatever. And if a student tells you that, I wouldn't say you're just going to take your medication like the doctor says, because when they go away to college and you're not there, they're not going to take it the same way you were administering it. I would say, okay, I'm glad you told us that. Let's meet with your doctor so you can give them this information so we could modify your medication plan. Because another byproduct of them going to school and not taking it, especially if it's a controlled substance, is there's a surplus at the end of the month if they're not taking it as often as they had. And in terms of the concerns about addiction, I frequently get clients that say, and I would say the same thing, if it's supposed to be so addicting, why do I keep forgetting to take it? Especially when it comes to short-acting meds. So that is something that really you have to have that dialogue with your parents. That's number two. Number one is the performance deficit. Number two, if you're going to take something away from this presentation today, it's talk to your kids. Don't go to school and advocate for them. Involve them in the conversation. And the most common thing kids with LD and ADHD find is that one of their bigger anxieties is that they feel like they have no control over what's going on around them. And if you have that conversation with them about what you may need to ask for, what problems they're having in school, etc., involving them in the process, first of all, you get better information. And second of all, it's very empowering to them. You're not going to school to talk about them. They are part of the conversation. They should be driving that conversation. And it's going to be particularly important when they go away to college, because legally, unless you're proactive and they agree, you can't advocate for them when they get to college because the law changes, okay? So medication management could lead to some diversion issues. If there's a surplus of medication, it can get stolen, it can be shared, and there are a number of issues. Also, I'll get to this later on, at college, under the law, if you give someone one of your pills and it's a controlled substance, under the law, no money needs to have to be exchanged in order for it to be considered a sale. And a sale of a controlled substance is very serious. It's a felony in every state, and it exposes them to potential prosecution, potential for discipline at school, potential expulsion, or other disciplinary actions. So, and it also kind of feeds into the myth that kids that take ADHD medication, we're kind of drugging these kids and they're kind of taking this recreationally. It's typically the statistics I've seen, it's the kids that don't have a diagnosis that are taking it recreationally or seeking to in any event. It's a difficult transition. I apologize for the formatting, but the social changes that magnify their disability really is when they go away to school. If they go away to college and they're going to dorm somewhere at a school, not only are you not there with them, but most schools, class attendance is not mandatory. It's not like high school where everybody knows where everybody is. They are considered adults, and many of these kids just don't go to class. They will flounder around and think they can make up lectures online or get notes from somebody, and before they know it, the semester gets behind them, and they typically won't know that until a poor grade on a midterm, or they're facing a final and they don't know what's going on. So that is a huge problem, okay? The other issue that compounds this is the change in the law. So when your child was going to high school or anywhere K to 12, they either had an IEP or a 504 plan. During those years, the school legally, under either 504 or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, have an affirmative obligation, we call that child find, to seek out children that live within that local district and evaluate them, identify them, and provide them with services. It's the school's responsibility, okay? Once they graduate from high school and go into post-secondary, that obligation vanishes. Under 504 does continue after high school graduation, but it's not the same, okay? They are entitled to seek accommodations, but they have to seek them. It's not the responsibility of the school. They're required by law to go to the disability office on campus, identify, register as a disabled student, and provide documentation about their disability and request accommodations, okay? It's very important that they do that. And another statute that interplays with this, I'm kind of stealing my thunder from later on, is that, it's, first of all, let me say, it's a significant problem with students, as I said earlier, because in many cases they don't want to go to the disability office and identify as being a disabled student. And the other part of this is the parents that wanted to kind of spare their children from labels and the advocacy nightmares that were going on. These kids really are ill-equipped to understand what their needs are, okay? If they're being told they're taking vitamins instead of medication in the morning, or, some other reason for their accommodations or services at school. They don't know what to ask for. They don't understand their disability, and many of them are in a state of denial about being disabled. And so without triggering those accommodations, they are losing out. And this is the unfortunate part, if they are failing and I get a phone call and I say, well, did you register with the disability office? The law protects you if you requested accommodations and the school either did not give them to you, or they gave you some accommodations, not everything you asked for, it was ineffective in implementation, you have an argument. If you have not done that, you legally don't. And a lot of kids are like, well, I didn't realize I had ADHD, or my parents didn't want to label me. We were afraid when we were applying to the college that they weren't going to take him if they knew he was disabled. Now, I have to say this. Everybody wants their kid to go to the best college possible. And I get that. But there's also something to be said for putting them in the deep end of the pool if they're not ready for it. And you certainly don't want to do that. And I would tell you, if the college is one that you're afraid of what they might think if your child has a disability and they need accommodations, it's probably not the right college for them. And when you are going through this anxiety-filled process of seeking colleges, if your child has special needs of any type, you shouldn't just be looking at colleges. You should be looking at college disability offices. And if your student has an IEP and they don't have accommodations under 504, but you think they're going to need them, how do you convert that IEP to accommodations at the school? Take what you know. Bring their IEP to the disability office when you're looking at schools and say, this is what he needs. This is his disability. What do you offer? What type of support do you have? Find out from them how open-minded they are about different supports. That's going to be crucial because your child is going to be expected to do that. And so they need to be set up for that. You need to involve your child at the transition planning stage of their IEP. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. And the sooner you can address those issues proactively, open up that dialogue with your son or daughter, the better off you'll be. Know what you're dealing with. Remember the minefield and the map. Okay. We talked about the lack of structure, support, and accountability. And inability or unwillingness to advocate for themselves. The absence of feedback is key. They don't get quizzes. Sometimes they don't get written assignments. Sometimes they have a semester-long project where there's a paper that's due at the end, and that's the only thing that they will get. I would say probably if you think that there's an issue with your child in a long-term assignment, they should probably steer clear of cases like that. Or the opposite. If they don't do well on final exams and they don't test well, perhaps a paper is a better way for them to display, especially if it is. One of the things we know about kids with learning disabilities and ADHD is that they typically have a very low frustration tolerance. But if it's something that they are interested in, they really do well and kind of throw themselves into it. It's kind of like one of the issues about ADHD that parents really don't understand is they'll come to my office and say, the teacher says he can't pay attention, but he plays video games for 10 hours, or I can't get him to stop listening to music. Well, it's not really an inability to pay attention. It's an inability to regulate attention. There's either no attention if they're bored and they shut down, or there is hyper-focus if it's something that they like. If they like video games, maybe they should be looking into some type of computer programming track in the college. Parents will say to me about music. All they want to do is listen to their music and talk about music. Well, be grateful that your child is passionate about something, and have that maybe try to bleed over into other areas of their life, but really try to build on that, okay? So all of this can really be a roadblock for kids with ADHD and learning disabilities. Now, remember the student before that said, it was all the administrative stuff? Well, they've got all this administrative baggage from high school, but now when they go to post-secondary, there's a lot of other things that you may take for granted. They have to do their own laundry, okay? They have to develop life skills. Are they getting enough sleep? Are they getting it regularly? How does that impact their performance? Are they eating appropriately? Okay, they are fending for themselves for the first time. And all of this can get in the way of them going to class and understanding what's going on around them. Do they have a romance at school that's going to be a distraction for them at this crucial stage? Okay? Medication management is another really significant issue, okay? Typically, you can manage medication from a distance with the help and support of their local psychiatrist, neurologist, whoever it is. But I would urge you that if they are going to go away to school, that you also look into a prescriber or a practitioner that is local to the school, where if there's an issue, a side effect, something happening that, they're getting an adverse reaction to something, someone that they can meet with and talk about. If they're finding they need to take the medication differently now that they're away from home, that is something perhaps, for instance, one of the least invasive types of a stimulant medication is the short-acting stimulant medication. Maybe because they keep forgetting to take it because either you as their parent or the school nurse is not giving it to them at regular intervals, maybe they need to look into a time-released version of that, or a patch, or some other alternate form of integration of that medication into their bodies. That's really important to kind of address ahead of time. Okay. We talked about IDEA leaving. They still can get accommodations. The question remains, and this is something for a court to decide, whether or not those accommodations are reasonable under the circumstances. You should ask for them. You should back that up with documentation, clinical documentation. Before they make the transition, you should get updated evaluations, because if they need accommodations for the SAT or something like that, they will typically need to see recent evaluations. So you should definitely contemplate that. You may be able to get them through the high school as part of the transition plan. Certainly, if you are asking for services at the school level. Okay, so the ADA still applies to them. The ADA is more about access. Section 504 is kind of about access. The ADA really contemplates physical access more than anything else. 504, interestingly enough, is not an education statute. It is an anti-discrimination statute that really says you can't discriminate against someone because of their disability as a protected class, but based upon their disability, they may need X, Y, and Z accommodations in class. And the biggest problem I find as a practical matter at the college level is that the disability office, far too few students will identify and ask for accommodations. So in order to justify their existence, they are typically pretty open-minded. It's not a fight like it is in high school. But there's usually a huge disconnect between the disability office and some tenured professor who's been teaching this class the same way for 40 years and doesn't care what the disability. I don't give pre-printed notes. I don't do it. I don't believe in it. And now you have an issue that has to be addressed. Okay, if the school agreed to this as an accommodation and it's not being carried out, that is something that needs to be addressed right away. You need to have that conversation with your children. You need to find out what's going on. You need to motivate them to speak up. And if necessary, you need to have a conversation with them about how you can get involved to speak up with them. Right. And that is where we come to school records, the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act, FERPA. When your children were in K-12, that was your best friend. FERPA basically says that you have an unmitigated right to your child's entire student history and education records, but nobody else does, other than the school administration. Their status as a disabled student is confidential and secret, but you have an unmitigated access to it no matter what, whenever you ask for it. When your children graduate from high school, they are considered adults, and it is now their right and not yours, even if you're paying the tuition. And you need to know that, and you need to know that ahead of time so you can have a conversation with your child. And you can say, do you want us to help you and be involved, because they need to sign a FERPA waiver for the school. And even if they do sign that FERPA waiver, it doesn't operate the same way that it did in high school. In college, and when they were in high school, you may get a call from the assistant principal saying, is anything going on at home? Johnny's not performing the same way. We're noticing something. Is everything okay? Are they feeling right? The college will not do that. The only thing the college is legally able to do if they have a FERPA waiver on file is answer the phone when you call, but you still have to initiate that process. And that's important to know as a parent. And you don't want to necessarily step on your children's toes, but you want to have that conversation. How are we going to go about doing this? Because we want to make sure that you get pre-printed notes, extended time, a reader if you're dyslexic, some other form of reasonable accommodation based upon your disability. And if you don't feel comfortable asking for it and being vigilant about getting it, we're here to help you and we want to help you and see what happens. And even if your child says no, at least you know. As opposed to calling the school, I haven't gotten any feedback about my son or daughter, they won't answer the phone, they won't talk to you, they can't talk to you. Okay, you don't want to find that out at the wrong time. All right. Another important thing, a diagnosis of a learning disability or ADHD is not in and of itself a guarantee to accommodations. You still have to show clinically that the disability requires, there's a nexus, a connection between what you're asking for. My child has dyslexia, he can't read from text. I need to get a reader for him, for his exams, for certain things, whatever it may be. My child has executive functioning impairment. I need some type of a coach or a faculty advisor that's going to meet with him every week or 2 weeks, or something like that. We need extended time. He's had it for the SAT. He's had it in high school. This is why he's got a slow processing speed. I can show you in the evaluations. And so those are the things that you need to address and know how to discuss and educate your children. This transition should really be, or the transition plan in high school for how they're going to transition to post-secondary should really be a passing of the torch to your children. And one of the other problems that I haven't mentioned, the elephant in the room, is that one of the problems with a neurological disorder is that there is typically a lag on their social maturity. So a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old may socially really be a 14-year-old. And so they may not be in a position to effectively advocate for themselves. So it's important that you are instilling this on them as they grow up. And I will say that secrecy, if you're not involving them, kind of breeds shame. And you definitely don't want that in a disability that permeates their sense of self-esteem in every way, okay? So what you have to show, the standard under the law for 504, is that they have a disability that substantially impacts a major life activity. And for a college student, their major life activity is learning in college. So that is how you address that. But you can't just say, well, they say he's got ADHD, so we want extra time. You need to bring those reports, understand those reports, go over them with the evaluator. What does this mean? What should I be asking for? Go through their recommendations and know them, so when then you're bringing them up to the disability office, you understand what you're asking for, and have your child be in that situation as well. Okay. I talked about child find and how it's not available in post-secondary already. You must self-report. That's the problem when you have all of those fish swarming around. You often get ahead of yourself. Okay. The transition plan under IDEA. If your child has an IEP and they have a learning disability or they have ADHD, between the ages of 14 and 16, part of that IEP process is the school is required to have a transition plan with you. Are they going to post-secondary in terms of a college? Are they going to go to a junior college? Are they going to take a gap year? What type of employment are they going to be looking for? Are they going to be going to a trade school because they're interested in something, and college is really not the appropriate place for them? Those issues really need to be addressed at that meeting, and your child needs to be there. They need to be part of that process. It's affecting their lives and how they're going forward, and that should really be, as I said before, the passing of the torch meeting, okay? And also you should raise with the high school at that transition plan, okay, he's not going to have his IEP anymore. So how does this translate into accommodations that we should be asking for? And develop a game plan with the high school, and also talk about your child's need maybe for, and I'm again getting ahead of myself, the need for accommodations for high stakes testing, the SAT, the ACT. What do you need? How supportive is the school? And one of the things that I think you should keep in mind here is picking your battles with the high school. It's often a fight for services, and it's going to get a lot worse with a lot of the federal cutbacks that we're seeing now. But the school typically fights you over services because of money. And there's not a whole lot going on in terms of spreading out the special education dollars across all of the families that need it, so they try to be as judicious as possible. But when you're asking for their help with accommodations for the SAT or for college, essentially, if you haven't had a good relationship with them, they're now getting rid of you because your child is moving on. So capitalize on that, okay? When he leaves here, what would he qualify for? Help us in getting him those accommodations and smoothing out that transition, because we're leaving you. You're not going to have us here anymore. That is the kind of mindset that you want, all right? And again, if you don't get that feedback from the school and they're not typically helpful, go to the disability office at the colleges that you're looking at and sit down with them and the IEP and saying, what does this translate to in terms of what accommodations he's eligible for or that he can access on campus. All right. Students are reluctant to report. It's a huge issue. And nothing that you do here other than maybe indoctrinating them in this process in a positive way is really going to help unless they step up and they're willing to report the disability and ask for services, okay? They just want to fit in when they get there. There are some things proactively that you can do to avoid them having to report. There are some things you can implement with them, like getting them their own ADHD or executive functioning coach that they can check in with, that gives them support. And it also takes you out of the equation. And I'm going to talk about that in a few chapters. I know we're getting towards the time now, so I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit because I want to take some questions at the end. Okay. All right. So it's important that they know that they really, as the adults here, have a say in what's going on, and they are empowered to kind of address these things. And even if the school says no, nobody can say he never asked for this stuff. This is the first time we're finding out about it. You're building a record, okay? All right. We talked about FERPA and the importance of having the discussion with your child to whether or not they will agree to sign a FERPA waiver. And it's very important. There are generic FERPA waivers. Most schools have their own form. And if it's just going to make things easier, have your child sign that form. And even if you come to an agreement with your child about, if you want to do this on your own, we'll start out that way, but if it becomes more difficult, we're here, we want to get involved, we'll have this conversation in 6 months. What I would say is what you don't want to do is you don't want to have that support make it sound like a punishment. Like, we're going to give you 6 months, but if it's not working out, we're going to step in and do this for you. Because essentially you're telling them you're not mature enough to do this. And look, kids with ADHD, often parents don't understand the frustration they see themselves. And what happens is when you take something like that away or you step into their shoes without a positive agreement or communication, it typically shuts them down. It develops a barrier between the two of you. which happen, look, as a parent of an adolescent, they will oppose things that you suggest merely because you suggest them. It's part of being an adolescent. Forget about being disabled, okay? And if you add the lag on social maturity and brain development, it's typically a third off. It becomes very challenging for them, okay? And so you really need to develop with them like a plan, because they're not going to have the same lesson plan that their high school teachers did. So if you can develop or have your children develop on their own some structure, support, and accountability if they're going to be away, is really, something that's going to be very significant, because they're not going to get it from the college, and you're not going to be there every day to monitor this. The other thing that I will say about that is that when you're having these conversations, there's often, and this is where coaching comes in, I'll get to that a little bit later, but I used to run a nonprofit that provided ADHD and executive functioning coaching for high school and college students, and specifically to make the transition. So I would get a lot of alarming calls from parents in, November. He's failing out. We got letters from the school, whatever. And parents will typically say that they have been struggling with their child's disability for so long. They feel like at this age, as a young adult, their child maybe needs to kind of try this on their own, and if they fail or crash and burn, maybe they'll learn a lesson from that. But it's hard to do that and take a step back emotionally from your child at a crucial transition, especially if they're disabled. And so, it really becomes an issue for parents that beat themselves up. And there are a number of ways to do this. One is potentially through the disability office at the school. And another thing is by getting them a coach that they can work with. And I'll show you how that works. I no longer work with this organization, but they're a very good organization. There are a lot of ADHD coaches out there that work with students and one of the good things about it is that these coaches, it's your son or daughter's thing. They develop goals that are their goals, not your goals, not their professor's goals, not their guidance counselor's goals, not the coach's goals. And they and their coach develop a plan as a partnership to achieve those goals in a positive way. And that's really important. You have to remember that going through high school and even in the home, as responsible parents, when they do something wrong, your job, unfortunately, is to provide them with negative feedback. And a lot of kids with disabilities are used to getting negative feedback. And I can honestly tell you a lot of my frustration as a kid was that I always felt that I was so angry as a child because I always felt that there was so much more going on behind my eyes than I was able to get credit for. And my grades really weren't a reflection of how intelligent I was. And it was my own fault because I couldn't get out of my own way and nobody understood that. And I really think that one of the benefits of a coaching model is that it's a talent-based model. They try to develop and have your child realize what they are good at doing and kind of build around that, which is really very crucial. And sometimes it can act as a pressure release between parent and student because now you're out of the equation and you're not just doing the discipline. They're working with a coach. They're doing their own thing. They're not out there alone. There's somebody kind of helping them with this. And I'll explain that a little bit more. And also, because of the way FERPA is designed, you're out of the loop as parents in terms of advocacy. And coaches can also help them learn to advocate for themselves and develop a plan to do that in a positive way. All right. Talk to your kids before the transition plan. See what you would like to see and what they would like to see. See where you have common ground. I would never in my practice do domestic or divorce work. But on the occasion that I have had or been involved, one of the things I say is, well, if you can agree on the fact that you don't want to be married to each other anymore, that's something we can agree on. Let's see if we can build from there. If your child is very worried about that lack of structure and where they're going, maybe it is time to talk about a community college that is closer to home for the first year, the first 2 years, or whether it's 2 years or 1 year, that can be a discussion that you have, but it's out on the table in a constructive way, as opposed to, well, we can't send you to college because you're going to fail out, so we got to keep you under our thumb. It's funny when I talk about coaching too, and I used to travel the country and do these presentations for, it's called the Edge Foundation, about coaching. And inevitably there would be parents, and some of them would drag their kids to the presentations, and somebody would raise their hand, a mom or a dad, and they would say, okay, you're talking about my daughter. This is exactly what she needs. How do I make her do it? Okay, can't make them do anything. And the biggest pitfall is parents may say in a constructive way, well, if you don't want to have a coach, we'll let you try the first semester without one. But if you fail, you're getting a coach. Now the coach is the punishment. And so that's problematic, okay? So I'll get a little bit more into how the relationship works, but these are all things that you have to talk about with your child, the FERPA waiver. Sometimes kids aren't mature enough to go to college or community college. You need to look at trade schools. If they're particularly good at something that they want to do and they excel at it, whether it's electronics or some type of craft or trade. I was reading these statistics recently about the fact that college is not, every parent wants their child to be as educated as possible, but going to college versus entering the working world these days is not the given that it used to be, because of the investment, the fact that student loans break the bank, and these kids are saddled with them for their professional lives. And if they're not meant for college, remember something. Okay, and I used to say this to a lot of parents, and I would talk about coaching, but the same applies to whether or not they should go to college versus some other type of post-secondary thing. And that is that college is expensive. It's incredibly expensive, especially if they're not going to graduate in 4 years. And so think about the money that you are investing, bless you, with your children. And if that money is not going to be an effective investment, think about something else. It's not just a financial investment. It's an investment in their sense of self-esteem. And if you force them into something that they're not prepared for, either at this time or at all, and they crash and burn, the anxiety and their sense of self-esteem, that investment that you've lost, you may not get that back, or that may be a lot more difficult. And so saying, you know what, maybe you could work for a year and they might appreciate college better if they have to go at night. Or, starting out at a community college or a trade school, and they may decide, you know what, I have gotten this license and I'm practicing in this area. If I went back to get a master's degree in this area, I might be able to get an even better job. That's a mature decision that they may make later on, which is incidentally why students typically do better in college than they do in high school, because everything's not a fight. They're, by and large, aside from the core stuff, they are studying things that interest them when they pick their electives. And so that kind of plays into this a little bit, but you still have to get to that place. And if they have to get those core elements close to home in a high school plus, maybe that's better off for them. If you think maybe if they were out in the working world, maybe they would appreciate the daily routine of post-secondary education more. And after working for a year, they say, listen, I'm ready to make this commitment to college. And they do it in a more realistic way. These are things you have to consider, and you have to talk to them. And that whole transition plan is really very important. And the sooner you have that discussion, the better off you are. All right. have your child sign a waiver if you're going to be in the loop and get information about about how they're doing in school with their professors and so on. And if not, at least you know, and you're kind of braced for what may happen later on. This is a slide that I should have taken out. One of the things that we are dealing with right now in a lot of schools is post-COVID issues. And, a lot of these kids, because they were home and there was a lot less structure, all of the magnifications that you see about their disability are further enhanced. Now, we're coming out of the tail end of post-COVID now, and things are starting to get back to normal. But the one thing I will tell you as a special ed attorney who really focuses a lot on school discipline is that I still see a lot of post-COVID. It's almost like they were locked in the houses. They weren't socializing, especially if you have a kid whose disability impairs their socialization. And once this was over and they were thrown back into school, it was like we let them out of cages. And so, that doesn't bode well to them. And if I can make an analogy, you have kids that weren't necessarily a behavioral problem when they were in high school. Maybe they were the quote unquote inattentive ones. But now there are parties, they don't have a curfew at home, there are less, if no, guide rails. And so these are kids that kind of drive off a cliff, or they kind of will really crash and burn because socially they're just not used to this, lack of feedback from a parent. So you have to take all of that into consideration. And if your child with a disability is still adapting post-COVID, you got to take that into the equation as well. All right. Let's talk a little bit about medication management. And I talked about this earlier a little bit, but diversion is definitely an issue on college campuses, and there are some frightening statistics about it. The general issue about medication, I will tell you, is that I'm not here to profess the benefits of medication. It's made a huge change in my life, but it is an individual decision that you have to make. I don't think you can think of medication as a magic bullet. It doesn't cure ADHD. Certainly, medication's really not going to help most learning disabilities. But you have to approach any disability with a complex, multimodal approach, okay? That may involve counseling, it may involve medication, it may involve parent support in terms of, there are a lot of coaches out there that strictly work with parents. There are getting services and accommodations at school, managing meds, and also there are a lot of other things that students can do. There's a lot of really fascinating research about aerobic exercise and its impact on brain function, and not just ADHD, certainly ADHD, but anxiety, depression, Alzheimer's. There's a book, I don't know if any of you have heard of, and if you haven't read it and you have concerns about ADHD, called Driven to Distraction. It was written by John Rady and Ned Hallowell. They kind of went in different directions. John Rady really went into the aerobic exercise kind of area and has written a number of excellent books. One of them is called Spark. And I would say to you, if there's been a reaction to medication, or your child has pushed back against medication, or you just as a personal choice don't want to do it, I will say medication is typically one of the more effective of the multimodal forms of intervention. But if they're not going to medicate, and that is their choice or your choice as their parents if they're not adults, they should definitely be doing all of the rest of this stuff, whether it's coaching, support at school, counseling, a therapist, really helping them understand their own disability and why they do what they do. That's really, a very important thing. If your child, as I said before, says to you that I don't think I need to take the medication as often as I do, accept that, go see them, their doctor with them, have them explain that to the doctor, develop a new workable medication plan, having in mind the whole time, how is this going to be managed from a distance? Whether we get local intervention or, our doctor is able to do it remotely. If the student has bipolar disorder, for instance, which is a common co-occurring disability with ADHD, ADHD is typically treated effectively with stimulant medications, but the stimulants can make the bipolar disorder worse. And so it's usually treated with antidepressants in those cases. And there are some antidepressants that can help with ADHD, but it's important that your evaluator understand that. I think the worst thing you can do is just have the pediatrician write a script. You want someone who understands. You want a psychiatrist. You want a developmental pediatrician that really understands what might be going on and to evaluate everything. Is it a learning disability? And one of the issues about learning disabilities is that when they're present with ADHD, the symptoms of both are magnified. And so that presents a bigger problem, okay? All right, let's see here. Medication diversion, right? Stimulant medication is a Schedule II controlled substance. That's typically what kids take. There is, as I understand it, there's really only two forms of stimulant medication. There's either methylphenidate or some type of amphetamine, okay? Which is not to be confused with methamphetamine. But dextroamphetamine is what I take. My doctor started me on Ritalin, which is methylphenidate, short acting, and I noticed a difference, but I also noticed that if I wanted to stop taking it on the weekends, for instance, I was very short-tempered. I was very irritable, and I told my doctor that is a common side effect. It's called a rebound effect. We started me on dextroamphetamine, and now I take Adderall, which is long-acting amphetamine, coupled with short-acting amphetamine during the day. That combination has really worked well with me. One of the things I would encourage you, I used to run an adult support group in Westchester County, and I would often tell adults or children with young adults, parents with children or young adults, to say that they should keep a medication diary. Don't expect that the medication is going to instantly solve everything. There is a science to this, but there is also an art form to this because everybody reacts differently. And incidentally, again, I don't want to give you medical advice, but one of the things I've also learned over the years is that it becomes more of an issue with females because a lot of kids there'll be an effective medication regimen, but when they pass through puberty, their reaction to medication, its effectiveness will change because their bodies change. And women's bodies, I am told, change more often and more radically than men's bodies as they progress through life. And so their medication needs and reactions will change. So it's very important that that be updated. But stimulant medication is a Schedule II controlled substance. It is illegal to possess without a prescription. There are a lot of safeguards on it. I'm sure if you've experienced it with your children or for yourselves, you know that the scripts are very regulated. You only get a 30-day supply, which, as I indicated earlier, all too frequently what we find with medication diversion on campuses is that if a student's supposed to take it once a day or a couple of times a day, and they take it once a day instead, at the end of the 30 days, there's this surplus of medication that's laying around their dorm room. And it's not uncommon for somebody to pop their head in and say, listen, I got a report that's due. Can I borrow one of your stimulants? Because it really can have an effect on anyone, even if you're not diagnosed with ADHD. But like any medication, I take a statin for my cholesterol, and my doctor has to check my liver every couple of months to make sure that there's no side effect. Any medication that's being taken without the supervision of a doctor is a problem. And, again, I said it can be a felony if they're sharing meds. It is problematic because they can get arrested, they can be expelled, but it also just feeds into all of those stereotypes that really are untrue and gives these kids a bad name. We're drugging these kids. It's wrong that we're drugging the kids. And it's unfair to them, and it's unfair to the ones who are who really need their medication. Okay, there was an issue that popped up a number of years ago. I would get phone calls in court if someone is arrested for a controlled substance and they're charged with a felony. What'll happen is most courts there, I don't know if you've ever heard of a drug court program. If they qualify for a program, it's a special program where they have to complete a certain amount of drug treatment. They take a plea of guilty to the felony or the misdemeanor. And if they go through the 18 months of treatment, or 12 to 18 months, they have check-ins with the court to make sure that they're not using and they're progressing well. At the end of the program, the plea is withdrawn and the charges are dismissed. And it's really nice to see, actually. They will typically have a graduation ceremony in the courtroom. These kids get a standing ovation. Even adults, they've accomplished something. It's a real positive thing. But I've had situations where, because I write for a number of disability magazines and I speak around the country about this stuff, I would get calls from parents that their son or daughter was arrested for diverting their ADHD meds on campus or somewhere else. And they would qualify for the drug court, and the judge would say, you can get into this program, but the condition is that you can't use those stimulant medications because that's what got you here in the first place. And parents would say, is that legal? Can they do that? And it's a voluntary program. You want to opt in because you're getting the benefit of the case getting dismissed. You always have the right to trial if you want to fight the case. And my experience has been the kids who land in court, or adults who land in court because of a medication issue, really will go off the rails if that medication is taken away from them. So, these are things you need to talk to your children about when they go off to college. Safeguarding their medication. Making sure that their medication plan, if it's going to be adjusted, that you're on board with that and we all know what they're taking, when they're taking, how much they may have left over. That's really very important, okay? To protect them and to protect everybody else. All right, safeguard their medication, take it according to the plan. Don't give or share their meds ever. It's really important that they accept that responsibility, okay? And I will tell you that to the extent you can at an early enough age, try to work with them about them taking the medication as opposed to you doling out. I mean, if they're in high school and they got to take it during the day, I understand that the school nurse is going to be giving it out, and that's fine, and that's legal, and that protects them. But your child should know what they're taking and when they're taking it. I've had too many parents that come into my office and say, well, we tell him it's vitamins, or I chop it up and put it in the food so he doesn't know. And it really is an issue, because when they go to college and you have to say you're taking medication and how are we going to get this to you? We've been giving it to you for the last 5 years, and they could be horrified by that. And they could push back even harder. So you really need to address that proactively. And any changes that you see, I talked before about a medication diary. That's really important, because the 45 minutes once a month you may see the doctor, it's a very small slice of your child's life, okay? And so they get irritable on the weekends when they don't take it, or if we take a medication holiday when we go on vacation, or, he seems drowsy after school or after he eats. All of that information is crucial to get to that clinician so they can tailor the dosage. What benefits are you seeing and what side effects are you seeing? And really let them know so they can tinker with this. There is a trend now, and some parents may say it sounds counterintuitive. Instead of giving one big dose of a medication, to give maybe much smaller doses of 2 or 3 medications. And it's not just the dosage and the medication itself. Sometimes it's the timing. There was an antidepressant that was supposed to be the holy grail of ADHD medications called Strattera. And it came out a bunch of years ago. And the beauty of it was it wasn't a controlled substance, so you didn't have to get the 30-day script, and you didn't have to worry. it really wasn't effective. But one of the things, unless a stimulant was being given with it, but one of the things they found early on when it came out was that when they would give it in the morning to the kids, they would be extremely lethargic during the school day. And they found that one of the side effects of the medication was there would be a period of fatigue, and they would break through that, and there would be a period of mental alertness. And so what the physician started doing was having the parents give it to them the night before. They would sleep better and then be ready to tackle the day, which is something that you don't know until you go through this trial and error. And the period of time may change depending on the body of the student and their chemistry. So it's very important that you provide that information to the doctor. All right, coaching. Let's talk a little bit more about coaching. What is coaching? And I would say the biggest disservice the coaching field has done to itself is their name. They call themselves coaches, which sounds like they just kind of like cheer for your child and give them moral support. And a lot of parents will say, well, I kind of do that for them. But it's very different. Coaches are very specifically trained in what's known as a non-directive questioning approach. They don't tutor your children. They don't teach them anything. It's not a mentor-mentee relationship because they're not trying to get your child to model their behavior. What they do is ask questions and pull information from your children and try to get them to recognize the talents that they have. It's a talent-based model. They develop a partnership. The student establishes goals. They are not the parent's goal, not the teacher's goal, not the coach's goal. It's the student's. It's something that they own. When I was at Edge, we did a study about the effects of a coaching model on college students around the country. And what was interesting is seeing some of the goals. There was an adult female student who was a mom, and her goal, she kept forgetting to pay bills. And her goal was to get the lights turned on so her kids could do their homework while she did her college work. And you just never know what the goals are going to be. And having them own that and progress with it, and every week or so, the coach has a check-in with the person. How are they doing? And if it doesn't work, another important component to the coaching relationship is this no judgment whatsoever, which is the opposite of a teacher's relationship or a parent's relationship, okay? For instance, a student gets a project. I have to do a term paper. Okay, what do you have to do it on? Well, I don't know. They told me I could pick a topic. Okay, so what's the first thing you got to do? Let's talk about this. What's the first thing you got to do? Well, I probably have to figure out a topic. All right, we're going to meet next week. You think you could think of a topic? You don't have to do any work. Just think of a topic that you may want, or maybe come up with a couple that we can talk about. You think you could do that? Could you commit to doing that? Maybe, yes. And they kind of take it. And if the student says, I really didn't think of a topic, I really didn't do it, the coach may say something like, okay, let's talk about what might have gotten in the way. Well, a couple of my friends from high school came up and we went out, and I showed them around campus. We went to a couple of bars, we went to a couple of parties. Okay, well, you definitely don't want to let go of your social life. Got any suggestions of what you could do maybe? Well, maybe I'll, give myself an hour to work on some stuff, or maybe I can, do some social things first and then, or do some schoolwork during the day and, socialize at night. And they come up with solutions that the coach can work with. But all of this comes up from the student. And the benefit of it really is that the coach is not providing structure, support, and accountability. They are enabling the student to build those things around themselves. And the goal of every coach really should be to get fired, okay? So there are a number of places that you can look into. There's only one drawback. And the drawback is that it won't work if the student won't step up and agree to work with the coach in a positive way. If they think that their parent is making them do this, they won't do it. So when I would encourage you, if you're interested in looking into this, do some research. Encourage your children to do some research. And one of the things, when we did that study at Edge, it was the first study of its kind, and CNN picked it up. And this was back in 2010. And we did a segment on CNN, which is on the Edge Foundation's YouTube channel, which has an interview with a student who's like 20 years old. Her name is Rory, I think. wonderful young lady, and she talked from a student's perspective of what it's like to work with a coach. She's not like, when I was fielding a lot of these phone calls at Edge, I could give them good advice because I'm an adult with ADHD and, I'm not their parent maybe, but I'm still as old as their parent, if not older. And so hearing the benefits of a coach from a student, a peer of theirs, is really helpful to them and gives it a lot more credibility. So, it's something to look into. I think the aerobic activity, when my son went away to college, I could not believe the modern state of the fitness facility that was available to these kids. Okay, it's there, it's free, it's not a gym membership, they have access to it. Okay, if you do nothing else, do that. You'll feel better about yourself, you'll blow off some steam. And there's real substantial research to show it has many of the effects of stimulant medication. Exercise, developing coping strategies, that's really important. A coach can help. And really, it becomes an introspective look at what's working for you and what's not working for you. Because I'm so forgetful, I got this great idea once. I was running this adult support group, and this guy came in. He was a physician who thrived in the emergency room because of the chaos that was there. And he said that what he used to do in the days when we used to have payphones, if he remembered something, he would run to a payphone if he was at the mall with his kids and leave himself a voicemail on his message machine. So he would always capture that thought, okay? So I thought it was great. I got a great idea to capitalize on that. I was going to walk around with a little tape recorder, and I was going to record every thought that popped into my head. And I did it for a couple of weeks, and it was a huge disaster because I never listened to the tape. And so, but I learned that I am a visual processor. I need to see things. That the audio part of it really is not something that resonates with me. And so it was a learning process, something that didn't work. I learned something about myself. And you have to encourage them to kind of do that, to develop these coping strategies. I did a lot of introspection when I was diagnosed and the issues that I had. And that girlfriend that I told you about with the basket, okay, I was like, wow, that was such a great idea. And I travel a lot, so I have left cell phone chargers and battery packs and beepers in hotels all over the place. And so I was like, I got to get a basket. And at home, I have a basket next to my bed, and my stuff goes into it at night, and it works well. When you travel, it's hard to pack a basket. So if you get creative, I actually went out and bought a collapsible dog dish, and I scrunch it down, throw it in my suitcase, and whenever I get where I'm going, I pop it out and I put it on the night table, and it contains my stuff. And it's all because of that girlfriend who I haven't seen in 40 years and who has no idea that I talk about her throughout the country. But it was really, an important thing to learn about yourself, to develop these kinds of strategies. One of the hardest things was to learn to copy over my notes, or I stopped writing notes in a notebook in college because I couldn't read my handwriting. And I started block printing, but I couldn't do that fast enough. And it wasn't until I was introduced to a keyboard that I was able to really think into a computer. And these are the things that it's constantly, I'm not sitting up here as someone who's got it all figured out, okay? And if you don't believe me, spend 10 minutes with my wife and she'll tell you how not figured out I have it. But it's a constant process of looking at yourself, not beating yourself up, embracing who you are. And again, college should be about this, about understanding what your strengths are and gravitating towards them while respecting your challenges enough to learn to dance around them. And how you get there, it's like saying, it's easy to make money in the stock market. You just buy the stocks when they're low and sell them when they're high. Figuring out how to do that and which ones is a lot harder, but that is essentially the equation. And hopefully they'll learn a little bit about that when they go to college if they're ready for it. Exercise, developing coping strategies, developing a plan about everything, accommodations, FERPA records and information, and really helping them advocate for themselves. That's going to be key. Address the legal issues. use the IEP and go to the college and say, what can we do? How is this going to convert into services? You don't have the restriction that you had with an IEP. There are specific disabilities that are classifiable under IDEA for an IEP. ADHD used to not be on that list. It wasn't until like the late 90s that it was included in the OHI category. But for 504 accommodations, it is literally any disability that impacts a major life activity. So just remember that. Okay, high stakes testing accommodations. I've done a lot of these. I find that the college board has taken a lot of heat over the last few years about doling these out when they're not necessary, and maybe parents seeking them to get a competitive edge for their kids. And that really hurts the kids who need this. And I found that a lot of these are won in the appeal because, if someone will come to me and say we got denied, and I will pool all of the documentation and really make a case for why it's necessary, getting records from this high school, the guidance counselors, why they supported accommodations for testing in high school, et cetera. And my experience has been that because they came under fire, they will give out accommodations, but they really need you to establish why they're necessary now. So you have to be careful, and you really have to document what you need. And the other thing I said earlier was make sure you get recent evaluations, because they're going to ask for that. It's harder for for the MCATs and the LSATs, but that is slightly improving. It's not as horrific as it used to be, but that's another story. And again, what you want to, if the criticism of the college board is that they're giving certain kids a competitive advantage, you really have to, in anything you write asking for these accommodations, you're not asking for an advantage. You are asking to level the playing field. That's what this is all about. Okay, don't give up. Update your evaluations. Get help from the school, have them write a new letter, seek legal counsel if you have been rejected a couple of times. I've been pretty successful with these. I know a lot of attorneys that have been as well. Okay, the pitfalls we've been discussing all morning have been the reluctance of the students themselves. You can do as many things as you want, but if they don't step up, it's going to be tough, which is why you have to energize them. You have to encourage them without dictating. And the other thing is that there's an invisible side to advocacy. Everybody thinks of advocacy as asking for or fighting for the agreement of the school to get the accommodations. That's only half of the battle. You have to be ever vigilant to make sure that even if they're getting everything that they need or that they're supposed to get, is it effective? Have their needs changed because they've matured or their medication is different or something else came up? So you have to constantly make sure that you are following up to make sure that the accommodations they're getting are still applicable, that they're getting them when they're supposed to be getting them, and addressing situations like I said earlier, disconnection between the professor and the disability office. That's really important, and to document that. All right, to sum up, and then I'll take some questions. Students with ADHD and LD have high potential, but they are severely at risk to fail or to, because of the performance deficits that are presented by their disabilities, or to be in school longer, to drop out. All right, the transition to post-secondary is probably the most significant one, and it will be hugely insurmountable unless you address it proactively. You know what you're dealing with, you understand your child's disability, and you get them on board. That's really important. But because these students are so intelligent, okay, if you can get by the administrative obstacles, not only can they survive college, but they can do really well in there. There are subjects that they are interested in. They can find their passion. They can pursue their passion. And so they can really shine there with the right support. and being proactive in addressing transition issues can turn high risk into high potential. Okay. Any questions? I hope this was helpful.
Before you start, I just want to remind people, this whole presentation is going to be on our website. It's going to be sent out. I know a lot of people are taking photographs of the slides, so just know that if you didn't, don't worry. We're going to be bringing around the.
However, this one there.
When you've mentioned getting the most recent evaluation, is there a difference between getting like this in-school evaluation, the educational evaluation, or are we looking at a medical, clinical evaluation? Does one hold more weight than the other for college?
One does not necessarily hold more weight. The question really was, is there a difference between the one that the high school does versus one that you get done privately? The only difference is if you are fighting with the school and there's a dispute over what the school's evaluator says and what you think should be the case, it would behoove you to get that private evaluation. That is important. Sometimes schools will say, well, we are required to do triennial evaluations, so we have to do them every 3 years. And we evaluated them last year or the year before, so we're not going to do another one. If the school is requesting something more recent, then you may have to go do one on your own. But if you know that's coming now, that you've had the Robert Tudisco crash course in transitions, you can anticipate that and maybe time the triennials in a way that gives you the closest to what you need. And if the school evaluators are giving you a fair assessment, that's just as valid. And in fact, you could argue that sometimes parents get their own private ones, and a private doctor might say more what you want to hear, but a school one is probably down the middle. But as long as you have something that has clinical documentation, the only other caveat I would say is the school districts, especially in New York City, the evaluators step shy of making specific recommendations. They say, and for recommendations, I leave it up to the IEP team. Well, they sent you the evaluation to do, so you would make recommendations for them, but they don't do that. Most school psychologists in suburban areas will also make recommendations. They're part of the curriculum. So if you can use it, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. But if the other question is, if you have to litigate with the college board or a college, having someone that you went to privately is someone that you can call as a witness if you need to. So that's a consideration, I would say. All right. There's one here too. Go ahead.
You want to go first?
Mine is quick.
Okay.
I was going to ask, does it matter when they do the transitioning? The talk to transition, you said 14 to 16.
14 to 16 is what the law requires. I would say when they're, a freshman in high school, as soon as you can, I would say, let's start asking about the transitional meeting. Go ahead.
Just quickly, because I held my daughter back. So at 14, and this is early for me to sit in a talk like this, but I figured it's never too early. She's leaving 8th grade and going into high school. So she has an IEP, and I have an advocate, and the team said, we don't do transition meetings, that you have to wait until you get to high school. And the advocate was saying the earlier, the better, so that we as parents can prepare her for her high school journey, knowing, what could be expected from her. And they sort of deferred and said, just wait until you get to high school to do that. But it's nerve-wracking because as I sit here listening to these things for a kid that's slow to grow, you're thinking a lot is coming down. And if you're doing this kind of preparation when they're 16, which they would be a junior, really doesn't leave that much time.
It doesn't, and it can be difficult. I would say two things to that. The question was if your child was held back and they're older chronologically, and the middle school to be honest with you, the middle school may not be set up to do a transition meeting with you, and so you might not get a very good one at that level because it's just not what they do. So that's one issue. But what I would also do is, if she's in 7th or 8th grade, but she's a little older, and you have those concerns, I would raise the issue of, you don't necessarily have to call it a transition meeting, but you can say things like, I'm concerned about this deficit or this issue for when she goes to college, and how does that look, and how are we going to address that at some point? And they may say, well, wait until she gets to high school, but I think you should develop that language in the meeting because that's your concern essentially, whether they call it a transition meeting or not. If you're concerned about what's going to happen when she leaves high school and you want to have as much lead time as possible to have those discussions, I would start to have the discussions, but you don't necessarily, if they've refused to call it a transition meeting, okay, we won't call it a transition meeting. But I'm concerned about how her IEP is going to translate when she leaves high school. And you know what? I tell this to parents all the time. Nothing I say is going to make the school agree with you. But if they don't, and you try to do that, and they say, listen, you really have to wait till high school to do that, I would definitely bring it up at the first high school meeting. But also, when you finish those meetings, even if they don't go your way, I recommend that parents should get home and make a detailed note of everything everybody said and write a letter saying, thank you for meeting with me. I agree with you saying this, but I really have major concerns and I disagree with that, and put it all into writing. And, the school is either going to ignore that letter, but you got it out there and you're building a paper trail, or they will disagree with you. Well, we told you our policy is that we don't do that in middle school, and it's not fair to your daughter because we're not transition planners. I think that you should, you can respond and say, but I still have these concerns because she is older than her peers. And I guarantee you that they are not sharing their response to you with their attorneys. And so they're saying things that you can maybe call them out on if there is a dispute later on. And you can address it that way. It's a difficult situation, but if they refuse to address it, I would, as early as you can when she gets to high school, and start talking about that. And you should always say, because she's a year older than everyone here, that's why I'm so concerned about this, and reiterate that, and put it in the letters, and it's going to be harder for them to dispute it at some point. I hope that answers that. Okay.
Who's a lawyer, and sorry, and she's like the pit bull. We stay very quiet, and they say, you're jumping the gun, you're not there yet. She's still very young. Well, she's emotionally very young, as you say. I mean, you have funk in the machine, you're a little bit younger, but high school comes fast and furious, and if you're not really sure if she's going to be able to survive it in high school or going forward, you kind of need to get your ducks in a row. So it'll be a fight. I just wanted to know, for your, when it was, maybe I was wrong.
You're not wrong,
to go too early.
but I do see problems with a middle school IEP team trying to deal with post-secondary issues that
They're not
you may
ready.
you may get bad information if
Okay.
you forced it on them. So
Okay,
just be careful.
I'll wait.
Okay.
Thank you.
There was a question here.
I want to speak with you offline because I have been through that situation, and maybe we share some notes. My original question I was going to ask, thank you for everything. It was really good, and I think we are on track with a lot of that you said, because we've been at this. We've had 4 children, and we're with our last one who's now 17, and we have implemented your strategy of try to time the triennial in such a way. He is due for a triennial. And hence, to your question, ma'am, we now have advocated and asked our team, and we're on track to get both a medical, like neuropsychological one, but then also, since he is dyslexic, we're also getting a comprehensive reading evaluation. So we're going across many different areas of suspected disability, which he's been on IEP since birth to 3 all the way through. So we have quite a bit of information. The question I have, though, you highlighted in bold on one of your slides about the language in the evaluations. And I just want to make sure, is that a legal phrase that really should be in there? And you said something about it's got to be substantially impacting a life activity. Does that language need to be in there? Should we kind of tell the evaluators, like, when you're doing your evaluation, make sure in your report you use the language that's going to help him to, as he submits it to the Disability Services Office, we want it to be useful to someone, and he's going to be successful advocating for himself.
Not necessarily. The evaluator doesn't have to necessarily use those words. That is the standard under the law. And the reason I highlight it is because too often parents say, well, his pediatrician says he's got ADHD, so they got to give him something. And it's a lot more than that. There are kids who function well with ADHD if it's not a terrible impairment and they move through things. You have to show that his ADHD substantially impacts him in school. And the evaluator should use language that indicates that the impacts, and they typically in their recommendations will say things like he needs to be in a smaller group. And that really is addressing that because of, and they'll also show the testing on his processing speed, or if it's a sensory issue where too many kids or too much commotion in the classroom will really shut him down, or the noise, or other issues like that. So they will typically do, but when you are advocating, you have to keep that in mind. Don't rely on a diagnosis. It's the diagnosis and how it translates into the classroom. That's the key to that, okay? They're coming around.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for everything today. You mentioned something, I think, when we were talking about IDEA. How much of the safeguards in post-secondary are at risk given what's happening in Washington right now? Because I think, obviously our states all regulate special ed, but what does post-secondary look like? And do you have any sense of sort of what we should have on our radar that could or could not be in existence by the time our kids get to college?
God bless you for asking.
I had the
question.
same question as to what if 504 goes away, because there's 17 states suing to kind of, that puts that at risk. And then also, are there legal protections we should put in place now to prep for the future?
Unfortunately, well, first of all, God bless you for asking that question, because it's a huge issue. And a lot of organizations that I am involved with, and I was talking to Eve about this earlier today, are getting very involved in public policy work in DC because it is an issue. Just so you understand the structure of it, each state has its own Department of Education, and then there's a federal Department of Education. And when it comes to statutes like IDEA, in addition to the law, each commissioner of education has their own regulations on how that law is going to be implemented with all these procedural safeguards, et cetera. And there is a huge problem now, not only on the prospect of gutting the US DOE, but also the funding that comes out of Washington for federal enforcement of federal legislation and regulations, as well as funding that goes directly to the states. And where this is going to be a particular issue is that where some states some states are going to opt to do this, some states are going to opt to do that. Well, if your son or daughter goes to college in one of those states, you're impacted. I will tell you right now, I believe every student is going to be impacted by this in a negative way, not just students with special needs. I think they are on the front line because these services cost money. And as federal legislation gets slashed, I won't even say cut, slashed, it's going to be a huge issue. If there is no U.S. Department of Education to arbitrate these disputes, and they are largely federal disputes, okay, when it comes to IDEA and when it comes to, you can't take away the DOE, the US DOE, without crippling IDEA. So, what I would suggest that you do if you want to be proactive is get involved with organizations like CHAD, like NAMI, like the Council of Parents, Attorneys, and Advocates, COPA, who are all mobilizing right now in Washington to protect your children and to ensure that the framework is still there, because it is a huge issue. It's a nightmare. Tomorrow, the COPA conference is, and I'm not there because I'm here today, but there is a lot going on about court battles and litigation that they're filing to block some of these orders. And it really is going to be an issue. Even in the reddest of states, I have seen administrators, the federal funding that they depend on for all students, not just special ed students, is going to be gone or significantly diminished. And the one thing, you always think of special ed parent attorneys as having disputes with the school district attorneys. The one thing we agree on is that they have to, it's unfair sometimes to them because they have to throw the blanket of education over thousands of children. And the money is a real issue. But I'll tell you right now, IDEA is probably the bedrock of protection for these kids, but IDEA has not been fully funded for years. And it's been a constant fight and struggle to do that. And now it's only going to get worse exponentially. My advice to you is contact these organizations, find out what they're doing, contact SPED NET, find out if they're doing anything, contact my office, contact your local legislators, really get involved, because it doesn't just impact students with special needs, it impacts every single student in this country. So, and for college, it's going to be particularly tricky because kids are going in different states from where they live. And if you have a dispute, where do you bring it? So that's a problem. Thank you for bringing that up. Other questions? Yes. Oh, wait, bring about a mic. Well, they want to make sure it gets on the screen, so.
I just wanted to ask, thank you very much, about LiveScribe and things like that at colleges. Do they permit those, do you know?
It depends on the school, and those are the types of questions that you ask. LiveScribe is a software where kids can talk into computers like Dragon and other things, and typically they will have some form of it. They will allow students to utilize it. The only time that it used to get dicey, probably not as much anymore, is students taping lectures. A lot of times that depends on the professor, if they'll consent to it and so on. But, it's funny because this impacts every student. And my son, who was not classified for special ed or anything like that, he didn't have ADHD, but he would say to me, they teach you subjects, they teach you how to read. They don't teach you how to take notes. They don't tell you what to look for and what's the most important thing. And that was really his significant challenge in college. It really is hard for kids to understand what the important stuff is. And I would certainly ask. I would think if it's software on his computer, if it's not intrusive, sometimes if it is like in a high school, if they have a system like with Chromebooks or something like that, you want to make sure it's compatible, and they typically won't allow you to add outside things unless, if you think it's an issue, you can ask for an assistive technology evaluation and talk about the type of software that your child needs and why. And, the school may have a contract with a different vendor, or they may allow you to bring something in, but you need to go through those channels first. But knowing that and knowing what your child needs and why is really the first step. Using that evaluation. Parents get evaluations. Oh, this doctor's got a 2-year waiting list. We got in. Oh, you should see, we paid $8,000 and the report is this thick. But they get it and they throw it in a drawer. Get it, go through it with the doctor, understand it, because you could go into the school and ask for accommodations or ask for services all you want. But you're the parent, and there's always this connotation that you want what's best for your child. Okay? When you go in with that evaluation and the testing and the sub-tests and say, he's got a slow processing speed, that's why we're asking for more time. He's, in the 1 percentile, okay? it's almost like it takes you out of the equation. It's like you're going in there with a prescription. Okay, the doctor says he needs it. I'm not asking for it because I want it, but this is what he needs, and here's why. And how do you dispute those test scores? That is really a clinical opinion, unless you're going to bring in a doctor that's going to say they're not valid. And many times the schools will say, well, we just don't have that service. So, and be aware of this too. The law says, and this is going to become more important as time goes on, the current financial situation, but the law doesn't say the school has the obligation to give you as much as they have available. The law says they have to give you what your child needs. And if they don't have it, they have to get it or provide for it in some external way. It's their responsibility. So remember that. Now, it's going to become a bigger issue with funding. And I wish I had a better answer for you. But keep that in mind when you go. And what you also don't want to do is you don't want to say things like, my son is, twice exceptional, and we really want a program that's going to maximize his potential, because that's not their obligation. Their obligation is really to provide him with appropriate access and to provide him with a free, appropriate public education. And what appropriate is could differ depending on opinions and experts, and that's why it can be an issue for a hearing officer or a court to decide at some point in time. Anyone else? Yes, sir. They'll bring you a mic. Again, I promise the PDF is gonna have the appropriate formatting, so you won't see it all jumbled up. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. And my question is regarding the funding from the DOE. In terms of college, does it make a difference for a private university versus a public university in terms of that?
It depends, because there are there are federal agencies that regulate or enforce 504. So the college funding for programs is not necessarily the issue. The issue there would be, you asked for something, the school didn't get it because they can't afford it, but if your child needs it, then you can make an argument that he failed, he was put on probation because they did not provide the accommodations that are reasonable. And if there's no one to go to, if you lose the ability to go to the Office of Civil Rights and the Department of Education to complain about this, then you've got problems. Now you have to go into federal court, which is significantly more costly and can be a bit of an issue. And traditionally, you couldn't go into court until you exhausted those administrative remedies. But as those administrative remedies disappear, where does that leave us? There's a lot of unanswered questions. And just, you should definitely plug yourselves in to information about this, about what's happening, and get as active as you can. I look, out of all of the years of schooling that I've had, I firmly believe that, and I used to say this about moms, but the most powerful force in the universe is a mom on a mission. And to the extent that you can mobilize, or a dad on a mission, you need to know what your child needs. You need to fight for it. You need to anticipate how these services may dry up at some point in time and why. And it is the personal stories that move legislators to do things, okay? And so to the extent that parents are mobilizing or organizations are mobilizing, they will need the support of their members and of parents who are directly impacted by these cuts.
Hi, I just had a clarifying question regarding ADHD versus learning disability. So for a student who just has ADHD diagnosed but no learning disability in a college setting, is the requirement to accommodate that the same? Is there any difference?
It's the same.
It is. Okay, they're not in it.
It's in under 504. It really is any disability that substantially impacts a major life activity. So.
I just have a comment to the question that came up earlier about, that your own child brought up about not being taught how to take notes. And many people aren't aware that the community college system, at least in Connecticut, has courses that a lot of first generation college students are tracked into, where they learn how to read a college text. They learn how to take notes. And I know this on a personal level because I used to teach those courses before I went on to teach at UConn. I taught in the community college system. And they're taught by people like myself who understand kids learn differently. So if you have a kid that goes through the public school system and you feel like they haven't gotten those skills, I strongly recommend that you look at our local community college system, because they have great introductory courses that teach those skills to help kids be successful at university.
And also, when you are developing an IEP or accommodations at the high school level, asking for things like, and depending on the school, this could be meaningless, sometimes it's meaningful, something like a resource room where there's a teacher there, they can work with them on organization, note-taking, outlining, things to organize themselves. And if you have to do that, outside of school, it's only going to benefit them. So you should be aware of that. It's important. I hope this was helpful. Okay.
Thank you.